I'm here to talk to you about planning a Liferay DXP upgrade. And when I say Liferay DXP, I am referring to both Liferay DXP and 7.0. There's not much of a difference between the two as far as what we need to do from the upgrade. So what's important here is asking the right questions. And exactly what are those questions that you should be asking? And that is an important question. One of the first questions that we'll be answering here. You'll notice this quote here. I don't know if any of you know where this is from. It's from a movie. And actually, there's quite a few movie quotes in here. I won't spend too much time going into them simply because I only have half an hour to talk. But I will say where these came from later on. So, biggest question you need to ask yourself is, why am I here? So in this case, there are generally two big needs that you have to meet. The first one is you have an existing Liferay project, and you need to know what it takes to actually do an upgrade, and basically what that upgrade would entail. Or you also need to present a plan of action. So exactly how you're going to do the upgrade, what are the steps that you're going to be taking, what are your plans for if something goes wrong during an upgrade, during a go live, and so on. So what are the questions that you need answered? So the biggest one is, why do you want to upgrade? An upgrade, typically, especially when we're talking about a big upgrade from Liferay 6.x to 7, typically requires a lot of development work. So you need to justify why you're doing this upgrade. Next biggest thing is, what is an upgrade? Obviously, you're moving from Liferay 6.x to 7.0, but there are other aspects that you should consider, and I'll go into those later today. And the biggest one is, what are my risks, and how do I mitigate them? Anytime you're doing a big software project, like an upgrade, there are risks, and you need to be able to identify those during your planning stages. And once you've identified those risks, you need to ask yourself, what is my actual plan? How am I going to proceed? Do I need to do code upgrades first? Do I need to test a database upgrade? And how would that proceed? So the first question, why upgrade? So there's quite a bit of documentation on this on the Liferay website, but from a high level, there are two main categories. First of all is our modern web experience and user experience. So this includes features like audience targeting, updated UX, new features like Liferay Forms, and improved mobile experience. And of course, the biggest one that you are probably familiar with by now is the move for modern architecture with OSGI, our migration from the old simply web app-based deployments into actual OSGI modules. You can get more information from this link, so you can get this from the slides once that's sent out after the after this event, because the URL is rather unwieldy there. And there's the less obvious part about an upgrade, and this is upgrading the system components. Oftentimes, this is something that people don't consider, but it is definitely a prime time to take a look at your architecture and figure out what you should change or upgrade. This includes things like the OS, or maybe you're going to migrate from bare metal to the cloud. Your database team might be looking to push a new upgrade to the database that you have, or maybe you're upgrading your Solar deployment or Elastic deployment. And of course, these days coming up, which I'm sure is prompting many of you to attend this event. So 6.1 EE, end of limited support, is the 21st of February in 2019. 6.2 EE, end of premium support, is coming up within months. And the end of 6.2 limited support comes in 2020. And of course, Liferay 6.2 CE has ceased development. So the next big question is, what is an upgrade? So what are the steps that you need to take in your upgrade? What do you need to plan for? Well, there are four major phases. One is analysis, so taking a look at your code and the features that you're using and figuring out what needs to upgrade and estimating the effort behind that. Planning, so figuring out what your plans are for your development cycles, your QA cycles, performance testing, having that all scheduled out and knowing what you're doing for those phases. After development, sorry, I missed development in here. So between planning and QA, there's a development phase where you're actually performing the upgrade on your code. And then the QA stage is where you are making sure all of your requirements are met, performance is meeting targets, things like that. And finally, the go live, where you're actually launching. So what does it take to upgrade Liferay itself? So there's two big categories when dealing with a Liferay upgrade. First of all is the functionality in code. So this includes things like the marketplace plugins. You need to take a look at the features of Liferay that you're utilizing. You need to take a look at what you're customizing, so the code that you deployed in the plugins SDK, and also taking a look at the configuration that you have for Liferay. And the last big one is the database upgrade. And this move involves actually upgrading the Liferay 6.2 database schema, or sorry, 6.x database schema, up to Liferay 7.0 and beyond. I mentioned before about the system components and upgrading them. A big one is often upgrading the OS. Obviously, if you're still on Windows XP, I'd be very concerned as to why you're still on there. Hopefully you're on something that's a bit more modern. And this is usually a good time for you to do an upgrade for the OS. You might be looking to upgrade your application server. I know many of you don't use, for example, the bundled Liferay. Instead, your application server is managed separately from the Liferay deployment. And in many of those cases, your IT teams and so on might be pushing for an upgrade to the application server for whatever reason, be it security and so on. Database, of course, similar story. Your DBAs might be interested in moving to a new version of Oracle or something along those lines. Similar thing for search. Search with Liferay DXP is a little bit different. So many of you might be on Solar right now, and that is perfectly fine for DXP. Solar is still supported in DXP. However, most of our development effort is focusing more on Elastic. So Solar is on a deprecated track, but Elastic is what we're moving forward with. So when you're upgrading to DXP, it might be worthwhile to consider moving to Elastic or placing that as something on your roadmap down the road. And then there is Java. So DXP does require Java 8, so you would have to upgrade your version of Java, which should be fine because Oracle has already deprecated Java 7. And of course, when you're doing this analysis, make sure you consult the support matrix. This is to those of you that are not aware, this is a document that Liferay provides that states what operating systems, what application servers, and so on, Liferay DXP actually supports. So here's where most of you are probably more interested in, which is the risks. How do I answer the question of what are my risks and how do I mitigate those risks? The oft-said statement, a plan never survives first contact. No matter how much time you spend planning your upgrade, something is probably going to go wrong. That's why it's always important to have a fallback. You need to accept that a problem can and will happen, and you need to have an answer of what will I do if something happens. Of course, throughout the analysis, throughout the planning, throughout the development, you are looking at your risks, updating your risks as you identify new ones. Analysis hopefully will catch most of them, but obviously, as many of you should know, when you hit development, new things always come up. So it's very important for you to track your risks as you're going through it, and basically keep that in mind, especially for when you go live. And one of the riskiest parts to any upgrade is the final deployment, the final go live. It's very important to plan for the worst case scenario here, So something goes pear-shaped there. I'll go into some description about that later. You always need a way to roll back and restore your old system. That way your users are not impacted, and you can proceed to fix the issues before you try again. And I will stress this multiple times. An untested backup is not a backup. Always make sure you test your backups, especially right before the deployment to go live, to make sure everything is still working. So now we'll talk about some of the categories of risks that you will see. So the first one is basically what I call the feature risk. So these are basically areas where, Liferay 7.0 is a major release. A lot of things changed. New features have been added, features have been changed, and all of these you have to analyze and understand. And also the last bit is not all marketplace plugins work in Liferay 7.0. Most of the Liferay developed ones have some form within the marketplace and has been updated, but it's just something to verify before you, or as part of this exercise. How do you mitigate these? So first of all, you need to identify and assess the risks that you have during analysis. So this is the first stage that I mentioned before, where you're analyzing basically your requirements. Am I using staging? Am I using web content? Am I using message boards? What marketplace plugins am I using? Am I using Social Office? So to know about Social Office is that Social Office is being discontinued because the modules within Social Office have been rolled into either the core portal or have been rolled into a separate standalone plugin for you to download from the marketplace. For all of the plugins, marketplace plugins, you should check with your with a developer for an upgrade schedule if they do not have a 7.0 version available. And there's some other considerations. So in my upgrades in the past, we have identified features that clients have implemented on their own that did not exist in the portal at that time. So this particular case was page customization. With this particular upgrade, we had to identify a way to migrate their existing page customization in their custom work system and move those into the Liferay feature, page customization. For this upgrade, this is one of the parts that took the longest, simply because we had to make sure that we could translate the data that they had in their data model into the Liferay data model. The next one is the customization risk. So every customization you make to Liferay adds risk. The two biggest ones that you'll see are the EXT plugins and EXT environment. We always stress that you should avoid these as much as possible. We do understand that sometimes you don't have a choice. You have to use the EXT plugins or EXT environments, but you should use those sparingly. But anytime you go into an upgrade and you see one of those, that raises a red flag. It means you have to take a look at this plugin closely to identify what your risks are from there. Another one are the hook plugins, particularly the JSP plugins, simply because JSP plugins involve overriding JSPs in 6.2. Those have changed substantially in 7.0. So chances are whatever you had before will no longer apply with 7.0. And of course, as I mentioned before, 7.0 is a major version. Some APIs and behaviors have definitely changed. So this is something that you need to be aware of and needs to be checked out during analysis. A big one that you guys are probably afraid of is the module development, so moving to OSGI. There are other talks that will go into this in more detail. I'll just go from a high level here, but it's just something to keep in mind. And just to ease your fears a little bit, some plugins that you've written, so for example, portlet plugins that you've written in the plugins SDK, can be migrated to Liferay DXP with fairly minimal effort. I have had cases where they've not had to make any changes at all. While others, they could require a rewrite. It does depend on the details of that implementation. So how do you mitigate these risks? I mean, there's a lot of them when you start talking about the customization risks. So the big one is identify the customizations that have been made to Liferay. So for example, you need to ask yourself, do these customizations use only the public API? So for example, the classes that are inside of Portal kernel. Do they use these APIs and do they use the official extension points? For most plugins that are using only this API and an extension point, your upgrade is going to be fairly straightforward. In fact, the upgrade tool that we have can automatically move some of the API changes over for you. And the one that raises flags for higher risk are definitely the customizations that touch internal Liferay. So the biggest one I'll stress again is the EXT plugin. Not all EXT plugins will be bad, but some of them will manipulate and change core Liferay implementation. With 7.0, because the portal has changed so substantially, most of that code is not going to be a direct translation. So there will be additional development effort tied to that. While you're doing this analysis of your custom code, you do need to identify what customization is still needed. As I said, with Liferay 7.0 and DXP, there are substantial changes. It's entirely possible that the changes are usable as they are and replace the need for a customization that you had previously. You also need to identify if your requirements have changed. Chances are you've already been running on 6.2 or 6.1 or whatever version of Liferay for several years, or at least a year. And that time, your requirements may have changed. So this is a perfect time to identify if you still need those changes or if you can discard them. It's also very important to check out the breaking changes list. So Liferay has, we've invested a lot in our documentation to make sure, to try and make this transition easier for everyone. And one of the biggest things we did was to document all changes that will break. And we have a list of these. These are things like changing behavior within APIs or simply removal of APIs and how that could impact you. So while you're analyzing your code, it's very good to have that breaking changes list available for you. And last but not least, leverage testing, please. I do understand a lot of people are on tight timelines and testing usually falls by the wayside. But when you do an upgrade, having unit tests, integration tests, and functional tests are a great way to document what your requirements were, like 1 or 2 years ago when you were implementing. And they're a great way to help you ensure the quality of your upgrade went in the correct direction. A few other considerations. One of the key things is to decide on a plugin upgrade path. So I mentioned this briefly, and I'll just talk about this more in the next slide, actually. A few things. Many of you are probably using Service Builder plugins. The good news for you is those are very easy to migrate. You don't need to change your database unless you are planning on changing your database model as part of this upgrade. But if it's remaining the same, you don't have to change that. All you have to do is regenerate your Service Builder modules. And those will automatically be upgraded to the 7.0 infrastructure. A little bit of bad news, if you're using a Liferay theme, because of how the themes are closely tied to the front end, so the JavaScript and CSS that's there, this would typically require a bit more development work to work through. So one of the biggest changes are the CSS classes. A lot of them have changed. We have an automated tool that can rename your CSS classes to the new ones, but there is still quite a bit of manual work needed for this. And the plugin upgrade path. So if you're working on Liferay 6X, you were developing with Plugins SDK. The good news is the Plugins SDK is still supported with Liferay DXP. It is, however, on a deprecation track. So if you so chose, you can remain on the Plugins SDK. And for most plugins, there's minimal upgrade effort required with this. You do not need to know OSGI to continue development in the Plugins SDK. However, once again, that is a deprecation track. So Liferay 7.1, we might remove it. And at that point, you would have to move over to an OSGI module. So the part that's probably scaring you guys the most are that the modules do require developers to learn a new framework. So OSGI and Liferay module framework. That being said, there is a lot of documentation on the Liferay website. In fact, we just recently released a very good guide that documents upgrades from various types of plugins and basically their upgrade path to DXP. I'll share that link at the end of this presentation. And also, Greg Amerson earlier today did a walkthrough of the code upgrade tool that can do some analysis for you and raise red flags. So check that out. That can help you identify potential problems in your plugins. And of course, so as I mentioned before, some plugins are easier to migrate. So for example, portlet plugins from the Plugins SDK, I've had great success leaving those as Plugins SDK bundles. But as I stated before, or in this case, you're not taking full advantage of the OSGI framework. So another thing to consider is the configuration risk. So some configurations have moved from the portal properties to the configuration admin. This is a new configuration management tool within the control panel in Liferay DXP. Make sure you consult the Liferay 7.0 documentation on this because some things have moved into that configuration. One of the biggest ones I can think of is the document library store. The file store configuration for the location, for example, has been moved to the configuration admin. One advantage of this is the fact that you can export these configuration files and you can deploy them as a deployable with your server, similar to what was done with plugins the portal properties, but it's simply a different way of managing them. That being said, there are still some settings within the portal properties, so check the documentation on that for details. And here's one that's probably scaring a lot of people as well, the database risk. In my upgrades and analyses, the biggest ones I've seen come from bad data references. So they have a dangling reference. I've had a case where a client deleted a company entry from the company table without cleaning up the groups, the users, and so on that are associated with that company. As it turns out, with Liferay DXP, we do a lot of integrity checks. When we see that, the database upgrade tool will say, nope, you got something wrong, go fix it. And the other aspect is that database upgrades can take a lot of time. This does depend on the size of your data set. So with a smaller data set, it can be fairly quick, maybe a few minutes. For others, it can take hours. The best way to deal with this is to run run the database upgrade tool as soon as possible. I've typically done this during the analysis phase with my clients. And this basically involves running a standalone tool that we've developed that actually performs the upgrade. So to those of you that have done upgrades in the past, the upgrades in Liferay DXP are a little bit different. If you simply start your server with a Liferay 6.2 database, it will stop and will not start. And it will say your database is out of date. This is because the database upgrade has been moved to an external tool. Also, when you run this tool, in order to address the second risk regarding how long this will take, it is a very good idea to get a good idea of how long the database upgrade tool takes to upgrade your production data. This way you can plan around it. If it takes several hours, you might have to take one strategy. If it takes half an hour, you might go take others. This all depends on your requirements. So some other considerations and tips. So one tip that I can't stress enough is that your runs for the database upgrade tool will probably error at some point, simply because I've seen a lot of dangling references. At some point it will error, and you'll be hitting your head against a wall if it errored during the part where the portal is upgrading from 6.2 to 7. and your database was on 6.0, and the 6.0 to 6.2 part took 5 hours. Because if you don't follow this step, you're going to be running that 5-hour upgrade again. Basically, what you should do is, between every step of the database upgrade, take a snapshot. So stop the upgrade, take a snapshot, back up. Make sure you can restore to that backup. That way you can snapshot and upgrade, do incremental upgrades, essentially. So the typical breakpoints I see between 6.1 and 6.2, between 6.2 and 7, and then right after 7 before it runs the upgrade task for the minor versions. So 7.0, 0.1, 7.0.2, and so on. Last tip, if you are upgrading from Liferay 6.0.11 or earlier, you must upgrade to Liferay 6.2 first. The database upgrade tool will not upgrade you to DXP before you do this. Now, these are the go live risks. Everything that we've talked about up to this point have focused on reducing these risks. So generally speaking, we see these types of failures when we do an actual launch. The database upgrade failed. So for whatever reason, the database that we tested on was different from what's in production, and production added some bad reference. Run the upgrade, it fails. What do you do? Deployment failures. So we've had cases where the code fails to deploy or the server fails to start, even though we've dry run this multiple times in the UAT environment. But for whatever reason, it fails in production. And then you might have quality of service issues. So the portal is being slow or it's not performing. You might have bugs or missing content. So how do you mitigate these? So as I mentioned, everything that we've done before has been focused on trying to reduce these. So running the database upgrade tool early on during development, using unit testing, integration testing, and functional tests. Doing what you would normally do for any major release, so going through your UAT cycles, going through your performance testing cycles, testing in a production-like environment, and always testing against production-like data. Or if possible, creating a clone of production data and running your tests against that. And once again, I'll stress, have a backup and test your backup. I can't tell you how scary it is to suddenly have your upgrade in production suddenly crash and go like, oh, what just happened? Okay, we need to go back, fix what's going on, and get the users back on their working before someone starts yelling at me. So once again, an untested backup is like having no backup. So before you do a go live launch, always test your backup. So what is my plan? Basically, you're going through these 3 main phases after you've done your analysis. Development, where you're upgrading the code and your configuration. QA, where you're running your UAT test, your performance tests, and you're testing the upgrade process itself. And go live, where you're upgrading the database, the code, and your system. Sorry, when I say code, I mean deploying your code. So for QA, what might differ from a normal QA cycle is the fact that you should be running a full upgrade on a production-like system. It's not every day that you'll be running the database upgrade tool. So you just need to make sure that you test that out in your QA cycles. And it's very important because this is the last time you get to mitigate your risks and resolve your risk before you go live and test your rollback strategy. During go live, you have a few strategies available to you. This is dependent a lot on what your requirements are. So in most of my deployments, we have a maintenance window. So set a period of 4 or 5 hours where we take down the portal, kick all the users out, and run our deployment and smoke test before we officially launch to everyone. Other strategies that I've seen involve parallel upgrades. So you have your production system up, users can still access it, but at some point you create a clone of the production data, run the upgrade in this separate environment, and then once you've smoke tested that new environment, you do a cutover. And of course, don't be afraid to roll back in the worst case scenario. The important part here is the moment something goes wrong, capture whatever information you can, and roll back your system so that your users can continue doing their work. And here's a few links for further reading. First one is that guide from Liferay 6 to 7, and I think my time's done. Anyway, you'll see these in the slides. Thanks. Done?